And welcome once again to the Only You, where we talk about mental health and social issues with me, Vince, here at the studios and Dr. Catino in his office. Please do remember this is a live show. If you're on listening now, you can type into the comments and we'll try to get to your questions. Of course, like, subscribe, and share. Dr. Catino, how are you doing today?
Doing great. It's a new week. I can't believe we're in the middle of February already. So I guess that's a sign of aging. Time starts moving a lot faster. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a good thing, but it is, right? That's
Okay,
what it is.
it is what it is.
Yep.
And as you say, as we have all heard or read, in our lives, time stops for no one. It continues on, and we do our thing. Tonight's subject matter is kind of interesting. I know you had to kind of coach me up on it a little bit because I'm not particularly into the, I guess, pop culture. I do my best to stay away from that. But it's about something that I've heard, of course, use the term cancel culture. What is cancel culture?
Well, cancel culture has been an evolution of different things that probably started around 2014. And if I remember correctly, I think it started as a way of calling out people who were not being supportive of your cause. For example, if somebody was very much into uh, anti-racist things or political issues, and let's say a company was very supportive of those environments, or a program on TV, you would call them out, and then you will start a boycott, right? You start a boycott. So don't use their services or their product or whatever. And that's something that's been done for a long time, but it has evolved into a way of for individuals, not only political issues or social issues, for individuals to actually shame and shun people away from smaller groups, right? It's also become very popular as a way of manipulating people. We were talking earlier about this famous rape music person, I think is into rap, who is demanding that a singer apologizes uh, for something he perceives was done to his friend,
Hmm,
and if she doesn't do it, he's going to cancel his show in a big show in California, right? So that's manipulative, right? That is, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to cancel you. I'm going to try to shame you. I'm going to try to shun you away from your environment. And people who have power and people who have money can play with that, right? They can tell him, get lost. I don't care what you think, or you don't want to show up at the concert. Don't show up at the concert, right? But when you move that away from systems and politics and big corporations, and you take it to the individual level, you're creating a serious problem, right? Because of uh, the media in particular being so protective and making it so easy for you to do things that you wouldn't do face to face, right? I mean, if you remember when we used to have conversations and dialogue, which nobody does anymore, there were some rules of conversing and having a dialogue in terms of don't judge, listen more, talk less, give your opinion. It's not about you, it's about the dialogue, right? Nowadays is if you say something or you make a mistake, anybody in the internet or social media can come back to you and say you are wrong.
hmm.
You should be ashamed for what you're saying. It can be as simple as you wrote it wrong, right? And say that is not acceptable to me, so I'm going to suggest that you get out of this group, right? And
Interesting.
you can say, well, that sounds terribly childish, right? I mean, it's we talked about this before. It's like, okay, we're playing in the playground. I don't like how you guys are playing, so I own the ball, so I grab the ball and I'm going home, right? Bunch of 5 or 6 year olds, and the ones who are left behind have a couple of choices. They have the choice of sitting down and crying because somebody took away the ball, or they can say, well, thank you, but no thank you. We're going to play something else, right? But nowadays in social media, everybody's behaving like a 5 or 6 year old when it comes to how do you do this to me? How dare you make a mistake like that? And I'm going to shame you, right? And what has happened at the other end is the person who feels threatened by being canceled, they become terribly afraid. Now, because I treat adolescents and I've been treating adolescents for 35 years in the hospital, I tend to see the most extreme cases. And I see kids who feel suicidal because they don't belong anymore. They feel more depressed if they're vulnerably depressed. Once this happens, depression gets worse. If people have social anxiety and they found a niche somewhere in social media where they feel accepted, and now all of a sudden they're threatened with rejection, right? Then they become more anxious. So the impact on the mental health of teens is significant, right? Now, what I'm finding out is that it has become a culture of the newer generations, right? It's almost acceptable. And big groups of people have become so afraid of being canceled that they will tell you in advance, right?
Hmm.
I mean, I can tell you, for example, my daughters will tell me, Dad, don't say that. You're going to get canceled. You shouldn't call that person this, or you shouldn't say that, because a lot of people don't like it and they're going to cancel you. And I mean, I have a very hard time processing that, right? Because what it's telling you is that people are already proactively getting defensive,
Hmm.
being restrained, having difficulty expressing their opinions. And I'm sure everybody has opinions, but very few people describe their opinions unless they go into social media and they go crazy and they get angry and frustrated and, the hateful speech and things like that. But there's nothing in the middle, right? So there's two sides here. One is how do we go about decreasing the amount of canceling? And second, how do we help people not be afraid?
Because it sounds like just, I mean, when we were kids, you were ostracized, you were pushed out of the group. But this seems a little bit more insidious and a little bit more deep. And I guess what you're saying is the fear of being ostracized at all would stop someone from even being a genuine person to express their ideas, express the things that may have moved the group forward.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you get into the point that people who are doing the canceling, number one, feel entitled to cancel, right? They feel entitled to negate freedom of expression to other people, okay? And they feel entitled to not have dialogue, right? Then you take it to another level. They feel entitled to you fixing it for them.
Hmm.
I mean, how dare you say that? Now you have to fix it for me.
Isn't that just narcissism of another way?
Well, it depends. I mean, narcissism comes in different degrees. I think that it reflects more the insecurity and fear of someone who feels powerful behind social media,
Hmm.
right? Uh, because to some degree is a very protective medium for them to hide behind a screen. It is faceless, and they can say whatever they want, right? I mean, let me give an example. I was we were myself and my students were interviewing a kid this morning who was suicidal, right? And they had interviewed the patient before I did, and then we interviewed the patient together like we normally do. And the presentation they gave me and the presentation I elicited when I was talking to the kid were a little different, right? They were seeing a different kid than I was seeing, right?
Hmm.
And we had a dialogue about why that happened. And I had to start the conversation by telling them that they didn't do anything wrong, right? That it wasn't a mistake, but it was a different style of interviewing. Okay. And part of my teaching was, well, you need to understand that you have to pause to listen to what the patient is saying. I call it the rule of 4 seconds, right? Count to four. 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, before you move to the next question, because you really have to listen to what the other person is saying, because your response also is going to be guided, okay, by the previous response of the patient. So I'm not having an interview, I'm not questioning the patient, I'm establishing a dialogue with the patient, right? You cannot do that in social media, right? And I was trying to explain to them, listen, if you're in social media, whether it's a message, whether it's a blog, whether it's um, Facebook, WhatsApp, whatever it is, right? When you read something and you listen to a comment, don't forward the comment immediately. Count to four, right? And think about what you're doing. And because I see these people on their phones nowadays just clicking forward,
Mm.
clicking, eliminating, and they're not really paying attention to what's in front of them, right? I think that there is stuff in social media that we can enjoy, but in cancel culture and nowadays with kids in social media, it's just something they do.
Mm.
I don't see people enjoying their social media a lot. Yeah, they enjoy the jokes, and so all of a sudden you hear somebody, cracking up, smiling, whatever. But in general, it's like tension. It's like what's coming next, what's coming next, and we don't give ourselves the time to pause, right? So whenever there's conflict, whenever there is dilemma, whenever there is the tendency to reject you, we have to take a step back.
Don't you think that inculcates, again, a society or a culture of fear, even beyond what we've had before? Um, I mean, not really caring what people think of you has always been a strength that people talk about. That you can be your own independent self, express your feelings, express your thoughts without worrying about the ramifications, because you're solid enough to say, okay, if people don't like it, they don't like it. But it seems like this culture's, especially for the younger kids, is changing significantly.
Well, it has changed quite a bit, right? Um, and it's very interesting for me to see what happens when we get a patient admitted to the hospital, whether because they're suicidal, they're psychotic, they are homicidal, they're severely depressed, they have a serious eating disorder. The first thing that happens is we take away all their electronics.
Mm.
You cannot have electronics in the psychiatric hospital, right? So it's fascinating to see this group of people, young people ages 12 to 17, interacting with each other with no social media. And it's fascinating. I mean, the lack of adaptive skills, they don't have them,
Mm.
right? They have difficulty communicating with each other. So they start repeating the patterns that they do in social media, right? Mirroring from the other person, reacting to any comment somebody else is making, taking things personally. It's like a mini universe of the consequence of social media, right? That they continue doing it because that's all they know. They don't know any other way, right? So it becomes very important that we help people, right? Not cancel, because those who are doing the canceling are also being damaged, right? Because they're feeling that they feel entitled to have a power and ability that they really don't have. Okay, it's borrowed from social media. Okay, I can assure you that if you get those people out of the little closet where they are hiding behind a computer, right, and canceling people, if you put them in a group, and try to have a dialogue and conversation, they don't have the skills to do that either, right? So the socialization and communication skills of teens, I think, is what's suffered the most, you know not only because of cancel culture, that's a kind of extreme consequence, but it also becomes very problematic in terms of those vulnerable, right? People who either have no access or very limited access, people who have severe depression and anxiety, people with bipolar disorder, people with substance abuse. And in general, the population, I would say, what we would call the average teenager who's not in a psychiatric hospital and is not totally depressed or anxious, their levels of anxiety are higher than our generation. Okay. And there's a phenomenon that we're seeing in the average teenager, which is chronic hopelessness.
You
Right?
mentioned that before.
It's like there's no light at the end of the tunnel, right? And I'm sure that any of us have felt that way at certain points until you realize that there's no tunnel, it's only you, right? And you make the tunnel, and you may want to go to the tunnel and not go to the tunnel. You control that. Now they feel like if they're being taken somewhere, they don't know where, okay? And very few of them know where they're going. And that's sad. I mean, that is sad because is permeating into society in general. So we're getting a society that is very apathic. They're in the middle. And then we have people at one end fighting one thing and the other end fighting another thing. And they're the ones who are trying to say something, but still not dialoguing with each other. At some point, we need to wake up the majority, the indifferent majority in this country, especially young people.
Well, they're the largest developing voting bloc as well. I think you've mentioned that before. So that becomes the most important thing uh, in our near future here with the midterms coming up in 2022, and then of course the election that people tend to spend most time on, the presidential elections in 2024. How do you think? I mean, it seems to me I always find this an interesting conundrum for people of our age and my age. We didn't have the internet, we didn't have this fast way of communicating. We have developed some social skills. And then so social media has actually helped us apply that better. What's the solution set then for people who have not, these younger kids, not grown up with these communication skills, even though they have the ability to communicate instantaneously? That's something we did not have.
Well, there are two or three generations after us, maybe four, and there have been some transitional generations who can adapt a little better. Uh, but I think that we suffer from the consequence of believing. Well, let me rephrase this. We're living with the consequence of first world entitlement, right? And we talked about this before, in that people feel entitled, okay, to not be questioned. People feel entitled to not participate. People feel entitled to not be part of, right? And I think that there is light at the end of the tunnel, if there's a tunnel, right? But the light of the end of the tunnel means that we have to start developing our communication skills again, right? And I think that to some degree people are hungry for communication. I think that this fad of social media, which primary purpose has not to do with communication, it has to do with money,
Mhm.
is gonna pass, right? There's gonna be something else. And they're gonna be winners and losers, right? And there's gonna be people who's gonna need a lot of help because they're gonna continue to feel entitled to being accepted, to feel entitled to being recognized. Okay. And I think in a paradoxical way, this has happened because we protected our kids too much, right? I mean, in Spanish we call it the crystal generation, right? They're fragile. Then they must be protected. They have no street smarts, right? I mean, let me give you an example. I work a lot with teenagers who are in gangs, right? And being in a gang is a form of a subculture with their own socialization skills and rules, with a lot of sociopathy in it. Don't take me wrong. I'm not speaking in favor of gangs, but you see it in prisons, you see it in society in general, in that these groups, as dysfunctional as they are, whether are in they're white or they're African American or they're Hispanic, right? It doesn't matter. They have rules, right? And they have rules of communication. And I find it fascinating when I have a number of them together, okay, and you are able to speak their language, how respectful they are,
Hmm,
you know,
interesting.
how much they are into implementing rules. And of course, some of those rules are in their own benefit, but they take charge. This is like a mini society, right? As sociopathic as it is and all the bad things that they do, they have, we used to call it, they have code, right? So younger kids nowadays don't have code.
Hmm,
It's like everybody's out there for their own benefit, okay, and fighting their own little wars. And none of them are getting together to develop a code of conduct, right? And I think that we need to help them develop a code of conduct, right? To develop the guidelines in terms of how are we going to communicate. And I think to a high degree it reflects our failure as parents and our failure as educators, right? Um, and I'm going to make a criticism because I think that in this country in particular, I don't see it in other parts of the world, but in this country in particular, we decided, whether you're on the right or on the left, to always make rules for the exception.
hmm.
So everybody has to accommodate to the exception. We forgot to make rules for the majority, right? So now everybody has to flex their values, their perceptions, and sometimes their realities politically, right? If you want to belong somewhere, or if you don't want to be canceled, right? So I think that we lost the ability to be respectful of somebody else's opinion out of our own fear, right? Um, and I also think that we have forgotten to find a way, right, to extend the hand and to understand, I know you're afraid. How can I help? Why don't you sit down here? Let's have a conversation. Now, in my practice, I have patients for all different political spectrum, from the extreme right, white supremacists, to the extreme left communists, right? I see them all because mental health and mental illness, it doesn't respect political boundaries.
It's universal.
Exactly. So I can have a dialogue with all of them. I don't have to agree with them. It's not about me, it's about them. So, how is it about them? It's about them being able to live their life less dysfunctionally.
Hmm.
Because when you're on the extremes, they don't realize how lonely they are. They don't realize how distorted their reality is. They don't realize that they're suffering, right? So, my job is not to convince anybody of any political leaning. My job is to help people live their lives in less dysfunctional ways. And that requires me being able to listen.
Well, that's on a one-on-one basis. You said that a lot of these people are feeling fear, and then it seems they look for solace in those dysfunctional sociopathic groups potentially, and it really sounds like part of the solution set is not the groupthink and the tribalism that we see so extreme now. It's getting back to one-on-one relationships and listening to people and speaking with empathy and compassion.
Absolutely. I mean, I was listening to a podcast the other day, and it was about that. It's about um, some groups that were studying these issues, right? Trying to study what happened to us. How did we end up where we are now, right? And trying to bring people from different leanings into groups, right? And to interview them all together. And what they found was something really fascinating that we hope we do more, which is people realized that they didn't know each other.
Mm.
People realized how much more they had in common with each other than different with each other, right? Of course, it's always going to be people at a very, very extreme who will never accept anybody different than them, right? But the middle 80%, I always like to say 10% on one end, 10% on the other end, 80% in the middle are willing to communicate, are willing to listen, are willing to hear who are you, right? Because the reality is that we humans are a lot more similar than different, right? Yeah, there's always going to be people who's going to pinpoint the differences, you know. You're Mexican, you have an accent, you came from Mexico. You're black, you came from Africa. You're from Italy, blah blah blah, the Irish and all that stuff. So if you want to use the differences as a way of perpetuating your fear, that is fine with me. But there's another 80% of people who are saying, well, you know, you have a family like I do, you have children like I do, you worry about similar things than me, like where you're gonna live, what you're gonna eat, how you're gonna get to places, how you're gonna have fun. I think that's pretty universal, right? But we have forgotten that. We have overstated the differences, and unfortunately, since the advent of social media, for all the wrong reasons. Okay.
It seems like that differentiation through the differences and that little tribalism is actually tearing each other apart. Instead of having a panorama, we have these little bubbles, as you mentioned before, bubbles of misery. It's like someone's shaking the water enough that the bubbles have come up, and now we have to slowly, hopefully over time, they start popping, and we go back to some type of, you know, homeostatic condition that can be livable. I mean, there's always going to be extremes, but you're right. I think now there's more bubbles. Than ever before.
You see, the translation, unfortunately, is that leaders and people in business have learned that fear sells, right? I mean, if you're a politician and you are after somebody's endorsement and that person kind of withholds the endorsement, and if you don't say it the way I like it and you don't follow my guidance, you're not going to be endorsed by me. That's a form of canceling, right?
Absolutely.
But the same thing happens with business. Business knows that if I keep you canceled in the bubble of misery, you buy my products so you can feel safe
Hmm.
or that you feel that you belong, right? But there's only so far that you can take this, right? Before you're actually damaging the basic foundation of society. And one of the things that we're seeing right now, you're seeing in Ukraine right now, is radicalism, right? To the point that people going to die. People die. I was listening to this anti-vax guy from Italy who basically said something really fascinating. He said, "I was wrong, and I have
Wow.
blood in my hands
Wow. That's an amazing admission.
because a lot of people followed me, and many of them died because they followed me. They believe what I said, right? Admitting something like that takes a lot of courage, right? And we're seeing it here, we're seeing it in Mexico, we're seeing it in Brazil, we're seeing it in France in some areas. You know, this radicalism that continues to perpetuate this fear and maintaining people in bubbles of misery so they can be controlled, right?
And of course, as we've said many, many times, the best way to manage that is to stick a hand of compassion out, help them come out of their bubble of misery, show them that there's no danger outside of it, and hopefully transcend the fears that forced them to build it in the first place.
Yeah, and that we learned from our experiences, right? That we learn to take risks, so we don't have to see, I don't know, kids in cages again,
Mm, absolutely.
right?
Well, once again, Doctor, much appreciate your wisdom, your input. I think it's a very interesting topic that probably, like a lot of our topics, can keep going and going and going. But for folks out there, think about that when you again, have the conversations when you see the people in a painful state. Just understand that that's based out of fear. Be a little bit more empathetic listening, listen more, talk less, extend some compassion, and maybe one day we'll all be able to burst some of these bubbles and be back in our little ocean again,
And
swimming
just
together.
and just to remind everybody, remember the rule of 4 seconds.
That's a
When you
great,
hear a question, before you answer, count to four.
that's fantastic.
You come up
Great,
with a better answer.
great advice. Thank you very
Hey,
much, Doctor.
thank you.
Take care.